The United States has split with its European allies at the United Nations by refusing to blame Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. The U.S. and France were at odds at the UN Security Council, where the U.S. failed to back a resolution labeling Russia as the aggressor in Ukraine's war.
A dramatic shift in transatlantic relations at the UN Security Council. For years, the U.S. has voted in favor of resolutions affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity and calling on Russia to cease hostilities. Under President Donald Trump, the U.S. is taking a different stance.
But the time for Russia and Ukraine to make difficult choices and end the fighting is now. We call on all other UN member states to join the United States in pushing for a durable peace that will bring stability to Europe and deter further aggression.
The U.S. is adopting a neutral stance that does not outright condemn Russia, causing a split with its European allies. In the General Assembly, it joined Russia, North Korea, Iran, and others in voting against a resolution drafted by Ukraine on the 3rd anniversary of Moscow's invasion.
And let me reiterate let me assure you that Ukraine wants peace more than anyone, but not any peace. We must be mindful of the fact that this is existential war. This is existential war for the entire democratic world, for our democratic principles and values. And Russia has repeatedly tried to dismantle this rules-based order and our security architecture. It is impossible to stop the aggressor by appeasing. Appeasement doesn't work.
The U.S. instead pushed for its own competing resolution named The Path to Peace, which calls for a swift end to the war without naming Russia as the aggressor. Ukraine's European allies, led by France, proposed an amendment to the U.S. text to underline that the conflict was the result of Russia's invasion.
Russia chose to bring war back to European soil. Over the past 3 years, Russia has been waging a brutal, illegal, unjustifiable aggression against Ukraine with a blatant disregard for international humanitarian law.
The U.S., however, abstained from voting on the amended version of its resolution. And eventually, the UN Security Council adopted Washington's original resolution, with 10 votes in favor and 5 abstentions.
That growing rift between the United States and Europe over Ukraine taking center stage at the United Nations. For more, we're joined now by Fabrice Pothier, the CEO at Rasmussen Global, an international political consultancy firm. Welcome to DW. We have the United States here siding with Russia in its votes at the United Nations. What do you make of this?
What I think you are seeing right now is a realignment, not just for diplomatic reasons, but I think there's something more fundamental that we saw in Munich at the Munich Security Conference with the US Vice President's speech, which basically was an anti-liberal speech. It was against a certain version of our society and democracy, which is very much aligned with the way the Russians have been criticizing us for being too open to certain groups or too tolerant and not enough towards other groups, mostly to the far right. So I think this is not just about diplomacy and about reaching some ceasefire or settlement in Ukraine. It's about possibly the US administration sharing some of the kind of visions of values with the occupant of the Kremlin.
Now, stay with us for just a moment, if you would. I'd like to take a look at something else that's happened recently regarding this U.S. move away from its EU allies at the UN. That's caused concern in Europe. And we've seen President Trump meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron at the White House on Monday, where Macron said that it was France's aim to build a long-lasting peace and that Europe was ready to be a stronger partner to the U.S. and to step up its defense spending. And Trump expressed hope that the war would be coming to an end, while Macron cautioned that any potential agreement with Russia should not mean surrender for Ukraine.
The horrors of this gruesome and bloody war can scarcely be overestimated. Hundreds of thousands of people Russians and Ukrainians in particular have needlessly died. And I've spoken with both President Putin and President Zelenskyy. And again, a lot of good things toward peace are happening, moving it, I think, pretty quickly.
And I know that the President has expressed the desire to be a player for peace in the region. This peace must not mean a surrender of Ukraine. It must not mean a ceasefire without guarantees. This peace must allow for Ukrainian sovereignty and allow Ukraine to negotiate with other stakeholders.
Let's get back to Fabrice Pothier from Rasmussen Global for comment here. Do you think Macron was able to get through to Trump in presenting the European position during their meeting at the White House?
Maybe the next question is, has he managed to convince Trump to change or to rebalance his approach to the war? And clearly, Macron developed the right arguments. We could maybe deplore that these arguments came too late in Washington. They should have been possibly put on the table already a month ago. But it's not clear whether those arguments, however correct they are, which is Ukraine needs some solid security guarantees in order to preserve its independence and sovereignty in a post-war context. Those arguments, I'm not sure, have really resonated with Donald Trump. This is, I think, also a big part of the Europeans, quite frankly, who have not managed to assemble a convincing enough, big enough plan to take to Washington and to say, hey, look, we're willing to put that much skin in the game. We're willing to take on that much risk and cover that much cost. But we do need the United States of America contributions to security guarantees, and we also need to have a seat at the table of any negotiation. So it comes a bit like a late mission, but not clear whether it made any difference at this stage.
Now, the U.S. president has also said that he thinks Vladimir Putin would accept European peacekeepers in Ukraine, and that, of course, would be a big departure from what we have previously heard from Russia. What do you make of this?
Well, I think it's interesting, but the key here is for European peacekeepers or European troops in Ukraine to know that the US troops have their back. And I think this probably was one of the key points of conversation behind closed doors between Macron and Trump, is whether the United States will be the guarantors of the guarantors. And this is where there has been reluctance so far by Trump and his advisors. And if there was some effort on that or some progress, I think it will really be key for the UK, but also Germany and other countries to be willing to take the risk, because there is a risk, obviously, of putting European forces on Ukrainian ground or in Ukrainian air and maritime space, territorial waters.
Now, this issue that we keep circling back to of making sure that Europeans also have a seat at the table over any negotiations over the future of Ukraine, are there arguments they could make to Donald Trump that would be convincing to the U.S. administration to try to make this case?
Well, I think the core argument is that Europe has some leverage in any peace resolution with Russia. Europe is the key power, in a way, for these sanctions. The US sanctions are obviously important, but not as significant as the EU sanctions on Russia, given Russia's economic dependence and interdependence with Europe. The same thing on the frozen assets. Europe has, as you know, hosts the majority of the Russian frozen assets compared to the United States of America. And therefore, if you want these assets to be recovered by Russia one way or the other, Europe will have to go along or to be part of those conversations. And then finally, interestingly, the Trump administration is very keen on the EU integration of Ukraine, because they see that as a way to shift the burden and give the Ukraine burden, quote unquote, to the Europeans. Well, that gives us another big leverage, saying, we can proceed and we can even accelerate the accession process, but provided we obviously are part of this peace settlement, because if not, why will we make extra effort if we can't even agree on the terms?
Well, thank you so much for joining us today with those insights. We've been speaking to Fabrice Pothier, the CEO of Rasmussen Global.